Norway. A freezing December morning, 1941. German soldiers are dug into a coastal town, rifles ready, machine guns covering every street. They are trained. They are armed with the finest weapons the Third Reich can produce. And charging straight at them, through gunfire, is a British officer holding a broadsword in one hand, and playing the bagpipes with the other. No rifle. No pistol drawn. Just a blade forged in a different century, and a battle tune that hasn't been heard on a real battlefield in 100 years. This is not a Hollywood exaggeration. This is not a legend that grew in the retelling. This actually happened. And the man doing it wasn't reckless, wasn't a lunatic thrown into combat unprepared. He had trained his entire life for this exact moment, and he would go on to do it again, and again, and again, until the German army started calling him something they never called any other British soldier. They called him the Mad One. The British called him something else. They called him Mad Jack. His full name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. Not related to the Prime Minister, but somehow, that almost makes it stranger. Two Churchills, fighting the same war, in completely different ways. Before the war, Jack Churchill was not a soldier building a career. He was something closer to a Renaissance man who happened to also carry a commission in the British Army. He had already served once, in India and Burma in the 1920s, then walked away from military life entirely. What did he do instead? He became a champion archer, competing at the highest levels of the sport. He became a serious student of swordsmanship, treating it not as a hobby but as a discipline. He played the bagpipes, not casually, but with real skill, performing publicly. He even worked as a model and a film extra, appearing in a movie playing, of all things, a Highland warrior with a bow. By the late 1930s, Jack Churchill was, on paper, an eccentric. A man out of step with his era, obsessed with weapons and skills that modern armies had left behind a century earlier. Then the war came. And the era caught up to him. When Britain declared war in 1939, Churchill rejoined the army immediately. And true to form, he did not leave his bow and his sword behind. He brought them with him. Deliberately. He told the men around him something that sounded, at the time, like a joke. Any officer who goes into battle without his sword, he said, is improperly dressed. Nobody quite believed he meant it literally. Not yet. Then came Dunkirk, May 1940. The British Expeditionary Force is being pushed back to the coast, surrounded, hammered from the air, fighting a desperate holding action just to get their men off the beaches alive. It is one of the darkest chapters of the entire war for Britain. And in the middle of that chaos, Jack Churchill does something that would earn him a place in military history forever. Using a longbow, he kills a German soldier. It is believed, by military historians to this day, to be the only recorded instance of a longbow kill in the entirety of the Second World War. A weapon that hadn't been standard issue on a European battlefield since the Middle Ages, used to end a life in the middle of the most mechanized, industrialized war humanity had ever fought. While tanks rolled and dive bombers screamed overhead, one British officer had just proven that his sword and his bow were not props. They were tools. And he knew exactly how to use them. Here's what makes Jack Churchill's story so much more than a strange footnote in history. This wasn't a man who got lucky once and became a legend by accident. Over the next 5 years, he would lead commando raids with that same sword drawn. He would be wounded, captured, imprisoned in a concentration camp, and escape. He would become one of the most decorated and feared commando officers in the entire British military. And when the war in Europe finally ended in victory, while the rest of the world celebrated, Jack Churchill reportedly said something extraordinary: he was disappointed. Not because Britain had lost, because the fighting was over, and he wanted more of it. This is a man who genuinely, unmistakably, loved war the way other men love their careers. So who was he really? How did a champion archer become one of the most terrifying commando officers Nazi Germany ever faced? And how did he manage to survive things that killed nearly everyone around him? That's the story we're telling today. After Dunkirk, Churchill's reputation began to spread through the British military. He wasn't just tolerated for his eccentricities anymore, he was sought out. In 1940, Britain formed a new kind of fighting force, the Commandos. Small, elite units designed for fast, brutal raids on German-occupied territory. Hit hard, disappear before the enemy can respond, strike fear into an enemy who thought the coastline was secure. It was, in many ways, the perfect home for a man like Jack Churchill. Conventional warfare had rules, chains of command, standard equipment lists. The Commandos had room for a man who believed a sword belonged on a modern battlefield. Churchill trained his men hard, and he trained them personally, in unarmed combat, in stealth, in the kind of close-quarters aggression that regular infantry training didn't cover. But he never stopped carrying his own weapons of choice. The sword stayed on his hip. The bow stayed slung across his back. And soon, so did the bagpipes. His men didn't see this as strange showmanship. They saw it as a statement. If their commanding officer would charge into German gunfire with a blade instead of a rifle, then fear had no place in this unit. This brings us to the raid we opened with, Vaagso, Norway, December 27, 1941. The mission was to strike a German-held fishing town, destroy fish oil processing plants that fed the Nazi war machine, and pull out before major German reinforcements arrived. It was a large-scale commando operation, and Churchill was in the thick of it from the first boat onto the beach. As the assault began, Churchill did something no other officer on that beach did. He began playing The March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes as his men stormed forward under fire. Then, sword drawn, he led a charge directly into a German position. Witnesses described it as almost surreal, a wall of noise and smoke and gunfire, and in the middle of it, a lone piper leading men into battle exactly the way Highland regiments had done a century before mechanized war made such a thing seem impossible. The raid was a success. German positions were overrun, the processing plants were destroyed, and the commandos withdrew with prisoners and intelligence. Churchill's actions at Vaagso earned him the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest awards for gallantry. But Vaagso wasn't the moment that cemented his legend. That came almost 2 years later, on a beach in Italy. September 1943. The Allied invasion of Italy is underway, and Churchill's commando unit is tasked with capturing a German gun battery near the town of Salerno, a position that could threaten the wider Allied landing. Churchill led his men on a night infiltration, moving quietly through enemy lines using the same stealth training he'd drilled into them. What happened next has become one of the most repeated stories of the entire war, because it sounds almost too extraordinary to be true, and yet it's documented history. Churchill and a small group of commandos crept close enough to a German position to launch a surprise assault. Leading with his sword rather than a firearm, Churchill and his men overwhelmed the position, and captured 42 German prisoners, along with the entire gun battery, using a level of surprise and audacity that a conventional firefight could never have achieved. Think about the psychology of that moment. You are a trained German soldier, manning a heavily armed position, and the man taking you prisoner is holding a sword. Not a rifle. A sword. It's not just a tactical surprise, it's a complete inversion of how modern war is supposed to work, and it broke the will to resist before real resistance could even organize. For this action, Churchill was awarded a bar to his Military Cross, recognition for a second act of extraordinary bravery, on top of the first. By now, word of Mad Jack had spread well beyond his own unit. German intelligence reports reportedly referenced him by name. To Allied command, he was becoming something between a war hero and a myth in progress. But Churchill's story wasn't one of endless victory. War has a way of catching up to even the boldest men, and in 1944, it caught up to him. Churchill was leading commando operations in Yugoslavia, working alongside partisan forces resisting German occupation, when his unit was surrounded on the island of Brac. The fighting was brutal, and Churchill's forces were eventually overwhelmed by superior German numbers. Nearly all the men around him were killed. Churchill himself was knocked unconscious by a grenade blast and captured. As a high-value prisoner, a decorated commando officer with a reputation the Germans clearly knew about, Churchill was moved through several detention facilities before ending up at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most notorious sites of the Nazi regime. This is where his story could have ended, the way so many others did in the same camps. Instead, Churchill did what he had done his entire life: he refused to accept the situation as final. He was later moved to a camp for high-profile prisoners, and even there, he attempted escape. At one point, Churchill and a fellow officer actually succeeded in breaking out, crawling through a drainage system and evading capture for several days before being recaptured near the Baltic coast. Eventually, as the war turned decisively against Germany and Allied forces closed in, Churchill was transferred toward the Bavarian Alps along with other high-profile prisoners. And in the chaos of Germany's final collapse in early 1945, he managed to escape for good, walking for days through hostile, disintegrating enemy territory until he reached American forces. The man who had led charges with a sword and bagpipes had survived a concentration camp, multiple escape attempts, and the total collapse of Nazi Germany around him. Most men would have called that enough war for one lifetime. Jack Churchill was not most men. By the time Churchill made it back to Allied lines in 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany surrendered in May. For most of the world, this was pure relief, the end of 6 years of devastation. Churchill's reaction was, characteristically, not that of most people. He volunteered immediately for the war against Japan in the Pacific, transferring to a commando unit preparing for operations there. He wanted to keep fighting. Not because he loved violence for its own sake in some simple way, but because for Jack Churchill, war had become the arena where his skills, his training, and his entire worldview made sense. Then Japan surrendered too, following the atomic bombings in August 1945. And Churchill, reportedly disappointed that the fighting had ended before he could get back into it, is said to have remarked that if it hadn't been for those damn Americans, the war could have gone on for another 10 years. It's one of the most quietly staggering lines connected to any WW2 veteran, not because it's cruel, but because it reveals just how singular Jack Churchill's relationship with war really was. For a man like him, peace wasn't just an ending. It was almost a loss of purpose. You'd expect a man like this to fade into obscurity once the guns fell silent. He didn't. Churchill stayed in the military for years afterward, eventually serving in postings that took him around the world, including a stint training Australian paratroopers, where he became one of the oldest men in the British military at the time to qualify as a military parachutist, well into his 40s, jumping out of aircraft alongside men half his age. Later in life, stationed in England, Churchill became fascinated by an entirely new pursuit, surfing. In the early 1950s, he is credited as one of the very first people to bring surfing to Britain, reportedly hand-shaping his own surfboard after seeing the sport during his travels and riding waves off the English coast years before it became a recognized pastime there. Whether it was a sword, a longbow, bagpipes, a parachute, or a surfboard, the pattern of Jack Churchill's life never really changed. He gravitated toward the things that demanded total physical mastery, total commitment, and just enough danger to make them matter. He died in 1996, in his late 80s, having lived through World War, imprisonment, escape, and decades of peacetime adventure most people could never imagine. Sword and a longbow, and he didn't just survive it, he thrived in it, earning some of Britain's highest honors for bravery along the way. It would be easy to remember him only as a colorful oddity, a strange footnote surrounded by tanks and machine guns. But look closer, and his story says something bigger about courage itself. Real courage isn't always about the weapon in your hand. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the scale of a war strip away who you are, and choosing, again and again, to charge forward anyway. Mad Jack Churchill never let the 20th century tell him how to fight his war. If stories like this one keep history alive for you, make sure you're subscribed, because there are far more untold heroes from this war still waiting to be discovered.